Hi, welcome to the channel. I finally experienced the highly anticipated online action RPG, but really it's an MMO, Blue Protocol, developed by Bandai Namco. Now, was I meant to? Probably not. Blue Protocol has been followed by people like myself for years now, and I started keeping up with the game in 2019, and I immediately told myself, this is it. This is the game I've been waiting for. It's an online action RPG, but really an MMO that is anime inspired, and that is everything I needed. And I wasn't the only one, as the more information we got about the game, the more the hype and excitement began to grow. Right up until the day the Japanese launch was announced and Amazon told us to wait another year. But we ended up hopping into the Japanese servers anyway, and I played a fantastic game that gave me a lot to talk about so I could answer the important question. Is this your MMO? Or in this case, your online action RPG, but it's actually an MMO. So Blue Protocol plays like most MMOs. You level up, gather materials, and do the main quest. However, where it stands out is its confidence in the player figuring stuff out for themselves, as by level 6 they really just let you go and do anything. Obviously you are limited to your level and are likely going to want to finish the story for unlocks and other perks, but it's really not a theme park MMO where you suddenly find yourself at the endgame. I felt as though very early on I had to really discover the correct sources of experience and the right places and activities to go to get a higher gear score. Added, it was in Japanese, but it wasn't really a tutorial heavy game unless you did the optional blue quests in the towns. This exploration let me try a variety of different challenges and activities while I tried to gear for the story. This is basically what you do in Blue Protocol, and everything works in unison because it's all intertwined. I took part in some challenge events which are practically open world boss fights, and I got some materials to make Imagines fight for me, while gaining experience and boosting my gear score. If I did a dungeon, I would gain experience and parts for my next weapon, which would in turn boost my gear score. If I killed mobs in an open world zone, I would gain materials and experience which could help me boost my gear score and level me up. So in a sense, everything was a form of progression, and this was a very smart way to structure the game. There wasn't really any form of horizontal progression, even though everything you did kind of felt like horizontal progression. It was all working in unison to get your power higher. It was basically diagonal, meaning that everything would benefit your overall power in some way, so it still very much was a vertical progression game. Now, even with how well structured this is, that would still feel a bit much for some players, so Bandai Namco also included a form of direction outside of the main story, adventure board missions. Now these missions take place in different zones at different levels and require the player to do a number of challenges to complete them. For instance, gather materials or kill 20 enemies, and for doing so you could increase your adventure rank, which would reward you with experience and materials you need to increase your power. These adventure boards quickly became my main form of leveling, as I felt I was always progressing by doing them. The story would also award the player with adventure boards, which would allow you to craft your next weapon by again giving some of the required materials and Luno to do so. So this gave me a sense of direction as I worked my way through the challenges, claiming only the experience and materials I needed to progress. Now, this adventure board system is brilliant game design as it merges every part of the game into a set of challenges, encouraging players to do everything. For instance, picking up materials, as I'm sure a lot of players would forget to do so otherwise. And this is a great way of encouraging gameplay in every form. Speaking of gameplay, this is definitely something I think the game does correctly in almost every aspect. So let's go ahead and start looking at the part of the gameplay that matters the most, the combat. Now, as for the combat, I can only speak as a Keen Strider, as it's the only class I played, and I have to say the experience was kind of bland for the most part. And this is mainly the fault of the enemy designs, as most normal enemies, but even some bosses, can be dodged by simply holding the A or D key while you shoot at them. And I was never really worried about most enemies. However, there were some annoying melee ones that would force me to move on occasion, but these enemies were still very easy to deal with. As for boss design, there were a lot of bosses and they all played a little different, but at the same time very familiar. Like, if you fought one boss, you'd essentially know what to expect from the other bosses. Like, a lot of them have this jump attack that creates a wave of fire underground, and all you have to do is basically hop over it. Now, depending on the boss, this can be really hard, as some bosses do have faster waves you don't really see coming unless you look out for them, but in most cases this isn't an issue. Other than that, bosses have red circles which you can step out of to avoid damage, and they will sometimes spin at you. There were a few bosses with vastly different behaviors, and these were usually the story bosses, as these guys had a ton of attacks and felt very challenging at times. And of course there was also the raid boss, as I was fighting in game and battling my frame rate in real life. The raid boss has two fights. The first one is genuinely easy, but the second one feels a lot more like what you would expect out of a raid boss, with a lot more aggressive attacks and damage towards players. Again, I want to preface this by saying I'm only speaking as a Keen Strider for now, as my views could change with another class. The Keen Strider itself was actually really good. As I leveled up and tried more of my abilities, I already knew what to expect from them, but mixing and matching and trying to see what would help me clear content faster was really fun. I made a build designed around elemental burst damage, as the Keen Strider has a lot of abilities that increase how fast this is built up on enemies. I also made a build that included more flat out damage options for me, but I landed somewhere in the middle. As the Keen Strider is a support, I felt like increasing elemental burst speeds would be super useful. I also noticed I was effective at destroying enemy weak points, taking off bosses' limbs, stopping them from using certain attacks, or just staggering them flat out. But the truly effective stagger was the elemental burst, as for most bosses this was the main combat mechanic. What we would do is build up an elemental damage attribute on the boss, filling up the meter above the boss's head, causing the effect to create a burst reaction on the boss. This would result in the boss taking a ton of damage and being staggered for a second, allowing us to really do a lot of damage to them. So in every boss fight we essentially try to trigger this as many times as we possibly can. The next form of gameplay was instance activities like dungeons and raid content. I'm happy to say Blue Protocol had a lot of them with an excellent soundtrack for each one. You would go from room to room killing enemies and finally encountering the last room where the boss would be standing, and all you have to do is slay the boss before the timer runs out. But doing this experience in a new setting and with new music each time was actually very exciting and something I looked forward to during my experience. The raid was also a huge highlight for me, despite the fights being basically the same with a different element. Raiding with 30 other players was a crazy experience and was very enjoyable. What lent to this feeling was the atmosphere, as the boss was absolutely massive and very loud, and he would just pummel his way through players like they were nothing. The raids also had these unique leaderboards you could check to see players awarded with certain medals for certain things during the fight. And they're still pretty fun, with certain mechanics you can try and interact with around the map and do certain things to the boss. And I think because they're not a permanent activity, the excitement and fun behind them will still hold up. They're also very rewarding when it comes to XP, so I don't see this being something that players will quickly burn out of, as it's inevitable that players will get bored of dungeons and raids. However, Blue Protocol also has content for when you get bored of dungeons and raids. For example, there's the arena where you fight a boss and a wave of enemies all at once and clear everything in the room to win, or the tower activity where you climb each floor and it slowly becomes more difficult until you reach the top. And finally, there's the late game content. There are time attacks, which I didn't end up doing, but you go into a dungeon under a timer and you have to meet a certain clear window in order to get better rewards, and there are also harder level 52 dungeons, so that is something I'm likely still grinding while writing this video, along with trying to master the hardest content in the game: fishing. I shouldn't have to work so hard to get one fish. The final aspect of the gameplay is the open world content, which I did kind of cover briefly in the first segment. There is one more aspect of the open world that I didn't mention, and that is the open world dungeons. Now, these are dungeons you can go into and grind for experience, materials, and other rewards, and they are actually super rewarding. I sat in the back of one of these dungeons, Dragonclaw Valley, for an hour, and I was able to go from level 49 to 50, gaining 600,000 experience very quickly. Some adventure boards will also send you to these locations, and they also have their own specific challenge event bosses that reward you with some cool battle imagine. Another thing I would like to mention is that my Japanese is a little rough, and by a little, I mean I don't speak Japanese, so the story was something I couldn't judge just yet. However, I know it gets good and the missions are really exciting, so I need Amazon to give me that global version as soon as possible. With some smooth animations and memorable cutscenes, the game's story truly does feel like its own anime, even with the way the characters express themselves in general. This is exactly what I wanted and expected, so thank you Bandai Namco for all of it. Now, how does Blue Protocol compare to similar games? Now, when I put Blue Protocol next to a Final Fantasy XIV or a Genshin Impact, it offers very unique things that both these types of players would enjoy, but it also doesn't offer a lot of things right from the jump, so I think the global launch will likely have the reaction where a lot of players will hop in for the first 2 weeks, and then we will see a steady decline as people wait for more content. But I'm really hoping global launches with all year one content and updates ready to go so that we can enjoy the core experience on top of the various improvements that will make the game better over time. So now it's time to take a look at the stuff I really liked about Blue Protocol and the stuff I really didn't like about the game. I immediately love the customization options for characters in the game and the way you can customize your character to look however they want, even if it's questionable. However, what ruins this is the fact that most of the cool stuff is behind gacha, and despite there being a way to gacha for free or get alternative cosmetics, I would generally prefer anything but gacha for the global version, as my luck is really not that good. There is also class customization, which I really liked, allowing me to try multiple builds and use any elements whenever I wanted, or collect various Imagine that I can use for fights or enhancing my stats. This made my Keen Strider feel very unique, which is something I love in MMOs and is really why I play them. However, I know there will come a meta in this game, as some of these abilities are just far better than the others for the Keen Strider. Also, I feel like the ultimate has a really long cooldown, and I know there are items that do decrease these times. I don't really like the fact that I have to use items for shorter cooldowns, especially when the ultimate is not something that is too crazy and all it does is suck the enemies into one place. I also don't like this. Falling off the map is something I do often in Blue Protocol, and it's usually by accident because I have auto run turned on and I make the wrong turn or something. However, there is a debuff that comes from falling off the map, and it is incredibly annoying and very punishing, and I don't know why they have it, because the map is designed in a way where you can fall off the map a lot of times, especially when you're in like these zones right here, because for some weird reason all of this land looks flat until it's not flat and you fall off the map. So yeah, mounts is something I actually don't like in Blue Protocol, and I hope the future seasons continue to give us a new free mount, or at least some improvements to the current mounts we have, because the movement feels a bit clunky and the control feels a bit stiff in my opinion. Now, as much as I enjoyed the adventure boards, they are actually very repetitive, but I was grinding, so I guess that is partially my fault. But they do end up feeling like chores, especially when they take a while because the item or enemy you're tracking is very rare. This also applies to the questing, which is even grindy at times and far less rewarding than the adventure boards, making them redundant unless they offer me a new adventure board or material I need. So I think they should actually make these quests more rewarding, as I'm sure I'm not the only one, and players will be less likely to do these blue quests if they're not rewarding enough. Finally, grinding dungeons in Blue Protocol is fun, but I don't know how to feel about double rewards yet. During Global, I would happily pay for double rewards for dungeon clears if it takes me 5 runs to get all the materials I need instead of 10. Free-to-play players will have to deal with a lot of farming. It's not an aspect I can't deal with. The difference between the amount of playtime required is only about an hour or so, but with how lucky you have to be to actually get a good weapon to roll after all this grinding, you'll likely have to still run more dungeons, meaning that if a good weapon roll took you 5 runs, for a free-to-play player, that could mean that it would take them 10 runs, basically 2 hours in the same dungeon 10 times, which is a lot of work. It's not an aspect I can't deal with, as the difference is only an hour, but with how lucky you have to be to get a good weapon to roll in Blue Protocol, people will be farming these dungeons day in, day out, and to save a lot of hours spent farming the same dungeon, I would happily pay for this, but I know it's going to definitely annoy some free-to-play players who just want the weapon they need. However, despite how I feel about monetization choices or mounts, the core Blue Protocol experience is a fantastic one that I'm sure will hook a lot of players and make them commit to playing Blue Protocol as their main game. But to a lot more people, Blue Protocol is going to be a great game to hop into and try for about a week or two before hopping out. Whether this is your MMO or not, there is a lot to experience here, and I highly encourage you to at least try the game when it comes out. And if you want to know more about the game, why not check out my channel, where I cover Blue Protocol as much as I can because I love it. And see ya!